Arthur Sterling sat in his high-backed leather chair, looking out through the huge glass walls of his penthouse. He was very high up, above the noise and the busy streets of the city. From here, the people down on the ground looked like tiny dots moving around. The cars were just colorful streaks of light. It was quiet in his home, the kind of silence that costs a lot of money to buy. Arthur was not a young man anymore. His hair was gray, and his face showed the lines of many years of thinking about business. He was a millionaire. Actually, he was more than that. He had more money than he could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. He owned buildings, companies, and land all over the country. But despite having all these things, Arthur felt a hollow space in his chest that money just couldn't fill. He had spent his whole life making deals, trading stocks, and buying companies. He treated life like a game of chess where he always had to win. Today, his large apartment was filled with people. There were waiters walking around with silver trays holding fancy drinks and tiny snacks. There were important people in expensive suits and sparkling dresses. They were laughing and talking loudly about their vacations and their new cars. It was a party, but it wasn't really for fun. It was a charity event. Arthur had invited a group of children from a local foster care center to his home. He wanted to show the world that he was a good man. He had paid for the catering, the music, and the decorations. He stood near the window, holding a glass of expensive wine, watching the guests. A woman with a kind face walked over to him. She was the one who ran the foster center. She looked a bit nervous talking to such a powerful man. She held a clipboard in her hands. "Mr. Sterling," she said with a smile. "Thank you again for opening your home to us. The children are so excited to see a view like this. For some of them, this is the first time they have ever been in a tall building." Arthur looked down at her and gave a polite, but fake, smile. "It is my pleasure, Diane. I am happy to help. It is important for the community to see that we care." He didn't really care about the community. He cared about his image. Next week, a big magazine was going to write a story about him. He wanted the photographer to get a picture of him shaking hands with a sad-looking child. He wanted the headline to say that Arthur Sterling was a hero. He sipped his drink and let his eyes wander around the room. The children were easy to spot. They were the ones who weren't laughing. They were wearing their best clothes, but you could tell that the shirts and pants were a bit old or didn't fit perfectly. They stood close together, mostly staying in one corner near the big glass window. They were looking out at the city with wide eyes. It was a different world for them. They were used to small rooms, shared spaces, and loud noises. This place was too clean, too quiet, and too big. Arthur watched them for a moment. He felt a strange irritation in his stomach. He didn't like feeling pity. Pity was a weakness. He believed that if you worked hard, you could be rich like him. If you were poor, it was because you didn't try hard enough. Seeing these children reminded him that life wasn't always fair, and he didn't like to be reminded of that. He wanted to just write a check and make the problem go away. Diane, the woman from the center, didn't stop talking. She started pointing out different children, trying to tell him their stories. She wanted him to see them as real people. "See that boy over there," she whispered, pointing to a kid with messy brown hair. "His name is Timmy. He loves science. He wants to be an astronaut. And that girl in the blue dress, that's Lisa. She is very good at drawing." Arthur nodded his head, but he wasn't really listening. He was looking past them, thinking about a phone call he had to make later in the evening. He just wanted the evening to be over so he could go back to his quiet routine. Then, his eyes landed on something that wasn't a person. In the far corner of the large living room, there was a grand piano. It was a black beast of an instrument, shiny and elegant. Arthur had bought it 2 years ago at an auction. He had paid a fortune for it because the auctioneer said it used to belong to a famous composer. Arthur thought it would look good in his apartment. It would make him look sophisticated. But the truth was, Arthur had never played it. Not even once. He didn't know how to play the piano. Nobody in his house knew how to play it. It just sat there in the corner, gathering a very fine layer of dust that the cleaning staff was careful not to disturb. It was a statue, a symbol of wealth, not music. It looked beautiful, but it was dead inside. Arthur stared at the piano, and then a thought popped into his head. It was a cynical, mean thought. He was bored with the polite conversation. He was bored with Diane's stories. He wanted to do something to shake things up. He wanted to prove a point to himself, or maybe to these guests who pretended to care. He put his glass down on a small table with a sharp clink. The sound made Diane stop talking. Arthur smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket. He straightened his tie. He could feel the energy in the room shift as people noticed him moving. "If you will excuse me, Diane," Arthur said, his voice suddenly loud and firm. "I see something over there that requires my attention." He walked across the room. His shoes clicked loudly on the hard marble floor. The guests parted to let him pass, like the sea parting for a ship. He walked with the confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't look at the children as he passed them. He was focused entirely on the piano in the corner. When he reached the instrument, he rested his hand on the sleek, cold lid. He ran his fingers along the wood. It felt smooth and expensive, just like everything else in his life. He looked back at the crowd. Everyone was watching him now. The room went quiet. The waiters stopped moving. The children looked up with curious eyes. Arthur's eyes scanned the faces of the kids. He wasn't looking for a musician. He wasn't looking for talent. He was looking for someone who looked the most out of place. He was looking for someone to make an example of. He wanted to show the absurdity of the situation: rich people drinking wine while orphans watched from the corner. Then, he saw him. A small boy, standing apart from the others. The boy was looking out the window, his hands pressed against the glass, watching the city lights below. He looked small and fragile. He looked like he didn't belong in this world of marble and gold. Arthur pointed a finger directly at the boy. "You," Arthur said. His voice wasn't mean, but it was commanding. It was the voice he used to fire people. "Come here." The room held its breath. Diane took a step forward, looking worried, but Arthur didn't look at her. He kept his eyes locked on the boy. The boy turned around slowly. He looked surprised. He pointed a thumb at his own chest, as if to ask, "Me?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, you. Come here." The boy hesitated for a second. He looked at his shoes, then back at Arthur. He slowly walked away from the window and toward the center of the room. The boy was maybe 10 years old. He was wearing a suit that was clearly too big for him, the sleeves bunching up at his wrists. He walked with a shuffle, his head slightly down. The contrast between the boy's worn-out appearance and the gleaming perfection of the penthouse was painful to see. As the boy got closer, Arthur felt a spark of excitement. It wasn't a nice excitement. It was the feeling of power. He was about to make a spectacle, and he knew that in a few minutes, he would be the only one laughing. He looked at the piano, then at the boy. He was ready to play his game. The boy stopped a few feet away from the shiny black piano. He looked up at Arthur, his eyes wide and unsure. Up close, Arthur could see that the boy's shirt was creased and the top button was missing, revealing a bit of pale skin. The boy looked small against the backdrop of the expensive apartment. He looked like a bird that had accidentally flown into a glass skyscraper and didn't know how to get out. Arthur looked down at him with a calm, cool face. He enjoyed this feeling. He was the king of this castle, and this was just a visitor. He could feel the eyes of every guest in the room burning into his back. The waiters had stopped serving drinks. The soft chatter had died down completely. Everyone wanted to know what the millionaire was going to do or say next. Arthur took his time. He adjusted his cufflinks, making sure the gold caught the light. "What is your name?" Arthur asked. His voice wasn't unkind, but it was loud. It was the voice of a man who was used to getting answers immediately. The boy swallowed hard. "Leo," he said quietly. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silent room, everyone heard it. "Leo," Arthur repeated, rolling the name around in his mouth like he was tasting a piece of foreign food. He looked at the woman from the center, whose name was Diane. She was standing near the edge of the crowd, looking very nervous. She was twisting her hands together. "Is this the one you were telling me about?" Arthur asked her, raising an eyebrow. "The one with the special spark?" Diane looked confused. She hesitated, glancing at Leo. She knew Leo was a quiet kid who mostly kept to himself. He liked to draw and read, but she had never told Arthur he was a prodigy. She opened her mouth to speak, to correct him, but Arthur didn't give her the chance. He turned his back on her and focused entirely on Leo. "They tell me a lot of things about you kids," Arthur said, spreading his hands out as if he were addressing the whole room. "They tell me you all have potential. They tell me that if you just get a chance, you can be anything. Doctors, lawyers, artists." He let out a short, dry laugh that wasn't really funny. "It sounds very nice on paper, doesn't it? But potential is invisible. You can't touch it. You can't buy it." He walked over to the piano and lifted the heavy lid. It fell back with a soft, padded thud. The black and white keys stared up at them, looking like 100 waiting teeth. Arthur ran a finger along the smooth wood of the instrument. "I bought this piano a few years ago," Arthur told the boy. "It cost more than most people earn in a decade. It is a masterpiece of engineering. But to me it is just furniture. It sits here. It looks nice. But it doesn't do anything." He looked back at Leo, a cynical smile playing on his lips. "Do you know how to play this, Leo?" Leo looked at the keys, then back at the floor. He shook his head slightly. Not really," Leo mumbled. "I used to play on a keyboard at my old house. But that was a long time ago." Arthur's smile grew wider. This was exactly what he wanted to hear. He had suspected that the potential Diane talked about was mostly just wishful thinking. He wanted to prove that money and class were things you were born with, not things you could learn in a group home. "Well, Leo," Arthur said, leaning back against the piano and crossing his arms over his chest. "I am a businessman. I like to make deals. I don't like to give things away for free. It makes people weak." He paused for effect, letting his words hang in the air. The guests were murmuring now. They could sense that something strange was happening, but no one dared to stop him. Arthur was too powerful. Leo just stood there, looking confused and a little bit scared. He didn't understand why this man was talking to him about deals. "Here is the proposition," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a serious, low tone. "I have a lot of empty space in this building. I have extra bedrooms. I have more money than I know what to do with. And you?" He looked Leo up and down, making the boy feel very small. "You are looking for a home. Isn't that right?" Leo nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Good," Arthur said. "So, here is the deal. If you can sit down right now, in front of all these people, and play this piano. I mean, really play it. Not just chopsticks. If you can play a song that makes me feel something, if you can prove to me that you have a soul worth saving, I will adopt you." A loud gasp went through the room. It sounded like the air being sucked out of a balloon. Diane stepped forward, her face red. "Mr. Sterling," she cried out. "You can't be serious. That is cruel. You can't bet on a child's life like that." Arthur didn't even look at her. He just held up one hand to silence her. "I am serious, Diane. I am dead serious." He looked back at Leo. "You play me a song, a real song, and you will never have to worry about where you sleep again. You will have your own room. You will go to the best schools. You will be a Sterling." It sounded like a dream offer. A fairy tale. But the way Arthur said it made it sound like a trap. There was no warmth in his voice. He was speaking the way someone speaks when they are betting on a horse. He thought it was a safe bet. He thought there was no way a scruffy kid from the system could play a concert grand piano. "If you fail," Arthur continued, his voice hardening just a little, "then we all admit that this is just a waste of time. You go back to the center, and I go back to my dinner. Fair?" The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. The guests were frozen. Some of them looked angry, but they were too polite to say anything. Others looked fascinated, like they were watching a TV drama unfold in real life. Leo looked at the long row of black and white keys. They seemed to stretch on for miles. He looked at the shiny surface of the piano, which reflected his own small, distorted face. He thought about his life in the group home. He thought about the noisy hallways, the bullies, the feeling of being invisible. He thought about the social workers who promised him things that never happened. Now, this rich stranger was offering him the world, but only if he could perform a miracle. Leo's hands were trembling slightly at his sides. He felt sick to his stomach. He could feel everyone staring at him. The weight of the moment was crushing down on his small shoulders. It wasn't just a song. It was his entire future on the line. I don't know if I can remember," Leo stammered. "It's been years." Arthur shrugged, a dismissive, careless gesture. "Then shake my hand and go back to your juice box," he said coldly. "But if you want a different life, the chance is right here." He tapped the polished lid of the piano with his fingernail. Click, click, click. The sound was sharp and impatient. "Sit," Arthur commanded. Leo looked at the bench. It was black leather and looked very soft. He took a deep breath. He felt a strange calmness start to mix with his fear. He realized that he had nothing to lose. If he walked away now, he was just another forgotten kid. If he tried and failed, he was still a forgotten kid. But if he tried, maybe something magical could happen. He took a step forward. Then another. He walked around the bench. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at Diane, who was practically begging him with her eyes to walk away. He only looked at the keys. Arthur watched him with a smirk on his face. He was already planning his victory speech in his head. He was thinking about how he would explain to his friends over dinner that charity was a nice idea, but in the real world, talent was rare. He expected Leo to sit down, maybe press a few random notes, make a fool of himself, and then run away crying. Leo sat down on the bench. It was firm, but comfortable. He was so small that his feet dangled above the gold pedals. He reached out and placed his hands on the keys. His fingers were pale and a little dirty under the fingernails. The white keys were bright and pristine. The contrast was stark. Arthur waited. He checked his watch. Any time now, he mocked softly. But Leo didn't play yet. He just sat there. He closed his eyes for a second. He blocked out the room. He blocked out the expensive paintings on the walls. He blocked out the smell of perfume and cologne. He tried to remember the sound he heard in his head when he couldn't sleep at night. He tried to remember the melody he used to hum to himself when he felt scared. He wasn't thinking about notes on a page. He was thinking about a feeling. The air in the room grew heavy. The guests shifted on their feet. Someone coughed nervously. Arthur rolled his eyes, preparing to call the whole thing off. He opened his mouth to speak, to tell the boy to get up. But before Arthur could say a word, Leo took a breath. His shoulders dropped. He stopped trembling. And then, he pressed down on one key. The sound that came out of the piano was not a bang or a crash. It was a single, clear note. It was a C-sharp minor, floating out into the air like a puff of smoke. It rang out against the high ceiling and the glass windows, vibrating through the floorboards. For a second, nobody moved. The note seemed to hang there, suspended in time, before it slowly faded away into the silence of the room. Arthur didn't move either. He had his arms crossed, his foot tapping impatiently, waiting for the mistake. He expected the boy to hit the wrong key, or to slam his hands down in frustration. But that single note was perfect. It was tuned perfectly, struck with just the right amount of pressure. It was a professional sound. Leo didn't rush. He kept his hands hovering over the keys for a long moment after the sound died down. He sat very still on the bench, his back straight but his head bowed. He looked like a statue of a young musician, except for the worn-out sleeves of his jacket. The guests in the room were completely silent now. The nervous energy had turned into something else. It was curiosity. They were watching this small boy, wondering what he was going to do next. Arthur felt a tiny flicker of annoyance. He wanted the boy to fail quickly so he could go back to his party. This slow, dramatic start was not what he had planned. He looked at Diane, the woman from the center, but she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Leo with her mouth slightly open, as surprised as everyone else. Then, Leo's right hand moved again. He didn't play a chord. He played a melody. It was a simple sequence of notes, climbing up the scale and then sliding back down. It wasn't a famous song that anyone recognized. It wasn't Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or a pop song from the radio. It sounded like a question. The notes were hesitant, searching for something. It sounded the way you feel when you are walking down a hallway and looking for a door that might be locked. The acoustics in the penthouse were amazing. The piano seemed to come alive. The sound was rich and full, filling every corner of the big room. The glass walls didn't block the sound, they seemed to hold it inside, making the music feel intimate and close, even though the room was huge. Arthur uncrossed his arms. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the smooth wood of the piano lid. He told himself he was just waiting for the boy to mess up. He told himself he was examining the technique, looking for a flaw to point out. But his heart beat a little faster. There was something about the melody that didn't sound like a child playing. It sounded like a story. Leo's left hand joined in. He found a deep, low bass note. He held it down, letting it hum, while his right hand played a higher, sad tune that danced above it. The rhythm wasn't strict or mechanical. It swayed and moved, like a tree branch in the wind. It was clear that Leo had forgotten about the people watching him. He had forgotten about Arthur and the deal. His eyes were closed, and his face was peaceful. He was playing for himself. The guests stopped shifting in their shoes. They stopped looking at their watches. The rich women in their diamonds and the men in their expensive suits were all captured by the sound. It was a sound that cut through their social masks. It was a sound that reminded them of things they hadn't thought about in years: lonely nights, lost friends, dreams they had given up on. The music was sad, but it was also beautiful. It was the kind of beauty that hurts a little bit. Arthur stared at the boy's hands. They were small hands, with scraped knuckles and short fingernails. Yet, they moved with a grace that Arthur had never seen before. He watched the fingers press the white keys, then slide effortlessly onto the black keys. It looked so easy, but Arthur knew it wasn't. He knew that playing the piano was one of the hardest things in the world to do well. He had hired musicians for corporate events before. He knew what professionals sounded like. This boy played like a professional. But it was more than just skill. There was a feeling in the music that Arthur couldn't explain. It felt honest. Most of the music Arthur heard at his galas and parties was polished and perfect, but it was empty. It was just noise to fill the air while people drank. This was different. This music had weight to it. It felt heavy, like a stone in your chest. The boy played a phrase that ended on a dissonant chord, a clash of notes that sounded wrong but right at the same time. It created a tension that made everyone hold their breath. Arthur found himself holding his breath too. He realized he was gripping the edge of the piano so hard his knuckles were turning white. Why is he playing like this? Arthur wondered. He is an orphan. He has nothing. Where is this coming from? Arthur looked at Leo's face. The boy wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He looked like he was somewhere else entirely. Maybe he was imagining a different life. Maybe he was remembering his parents, if he ever knew them. Or maybe he was just letting out all the feelings he had to keep bottled up inside the group home. The music was his voice. It was the only way he could say the things he didn't have the words for. The silence in the room was absolute now. No one coughed. No one whispered. Even the sounds of the city outside the window seemed to disappear, drowned out by the flow of the piano. It was as if the world had stopped spinning just to listen to this boy play. Arthur felt a strange sensation in his throat. It felt tight. He tried to swallow, but it was difficult. He told himself it was just the dry air in the apartment. He told himself he was tired. But deep down, he knew it was something else. The music was getting to him. It was slipping past his defenses, past the wall he had built around his heart over 50 years. The melody changed. It became a little faster, a little more urgent. The boy's hands moved further apart, stretching to reach the high and low ends of the keyboard. The sound grew louder, filling the room like a rising tide. It wasn't angry music. It was desperate. It sounded like someone running in the dark, looking for a light switch. Arthur watched, mesmerized. He had forgotten all about his mockery. He had forgotten about the deal he had made to adopt the boy if he played well. At that moment, the money and the adoption didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the sound. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pang of jealousy. This boy, with nothing in the world, could create something this beautiful. Arthur, who had everything, could only buy it. He could never make it. The music began to slow down. The urgent notes turned into long, slow chords. It sounded like the sun going down behind a mountain, casting long shadows. The boy's hands were moving gently now, caressing the keys rather than striking them. He was bringing the song to an end. Arthur realized his hands were trembling. He quickly pulled them off the piano lid and hid them behind his back. He looked around the room. He saw that many of the guests had tears in their eyes. Some were holding hands. The cynical, bored atmosphere of the party had completely vanished. They weren't rich and poor anymore. They were just people, listening to a boy pour his heart out. Leo played the final chord. It was a simple, major chord. It sounded like a resolution, like a sigh of relief. He held the keys down, letting the sound ring out and fade into the air, just like that first note he played. Then, he lifted his hands off the keyboard and placed them in his lap. The silence rushed back in, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a full silence, heavy with emotion. The air seemed to shimmer around the piano. No one spoke for a long time. They just looked at the small boy sitting on the bench, looking down at his shoes, waiting for a reaction. The last note of the piano seemed to hang in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam, refusing to disappear completely. The apartment was perfectly quiet. Not a single person spoke. Not a glass clinked. Even the hum of the city traffic below seemed to have paused out of respect. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a blanket that has been thrown over a crowd. Arthur stood frozen by the side of the piano. His plan had backfired completely. He had expected a clumsy performance, a few wrong notes that would give him an excuse to dismiss the boy and prove his cynical point about the world. Instead, he had been ambushed by beauty. He felt as though someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. It was a physical sensation, a tightness in his throat and a stinging behind his eyes that he hadn't felt in decades. He looked at his hands. They were resting on the cold, hard surface of the piano lid. Only moments ago, he had been gripping it in anticipation, waiting for the failure. Now, his fingers were trembling. It was a slight tremor, hardly visible to anyone else, but Arthur could feel it. He quickly pulled his hands away and crossed his arms, trying to look like his usual composed self. But the mask was slipping. The music had cracked it. Arthur looked at Leo. The boy was sitting still on the bench, his hands resting in his lap. His head was bowed slightly. He looked exhausted, as if playing that song had taken every bit of energy he had. He wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't looking at Arthur with a smug expression, as if to say, "I won." He just looked sad and small. The music had been a way for him to speak, and now that he had spoken, he seemed to retreat back into his shell. Around the room, the guests were exchanging glances. The socialites, the businessmen, and the politicians were all looking at each other with wide eyes. They were used to seeing expensive things, paintings, cars, jewelry, but they were rarely moved by them. This was different. This was raw human emotion served to them on a silver platter, and they didn't quite know how to digest it. Some of the women were dabbing their eyes with tissues, trying not to ruin their makeup. One of the older men, a CEO who Arthur knew to be a hard man, had taken off his glasses and was rubbing his face. Diane, the woman from the center, was standing near the back of the room. She had her hand over her mouth. She looked shocked. She knew Leo was a quiet kid, but she had no idea he carried that kind of world inside him. She looked from Leo to Arthur, terrified of what the millionaire would say. She knew his reputation. She knew he didn't like to lose. She was afraid he would find a way to be cruel, even after hearing something so beautiful. Arthur cleared his throat. The sound was loud in the quiet room, like a gun going off. A few people jumped. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He had to cough and start again. That was adequate, Arthur said. It was a lie. It was a terrible, stupid lie. The music had been magnificent, not adequate. But Arthur's pride was fighting a war against his emotions. He couldn't bring himself to admit, in front of all these people, that a 10-year-old boy in a cheap suit had just made him feel more alive than he had felt in 20 years. He looked down at Leo. "You promised me a song," Arthur said, his voice sounding strange and tight. "You certainly gave me one." Leo looked up then. He met Arthur's gaze. There was no fear in the boy's eyes anymore. There was just a deep, piercing calm. It was the look of someone who has shared their soul and has nothing left to hide. "Did I pass?" Leo asked quietly. It wasn't a cheeky question. It was a genuine, simple question from a child who was used to being tested and graded. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He remembered the deal he had made. "Play this piano and I'll adopt you." He had said it as a joke. He had said it to be cruel. But the joke was on him now. The boy had held up his end of the bargain. He had played. And he had played in a way that had torn down the walls of Arthur's fortress. Arthur looked around the room. Everyone was waiting for his verdict. He realized that he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't just say good job and send the boy back to the group home. The music had created a bond. It was an invisible contract that was stronger than any piece of paper. By playing that song, Leo had earned the right to be heard. And Arthur had lost the right to be indifferent. The millionaire took a deep breath. He felt his defenses crumbling. He thought about his own life. He thought about the big, empty apartment that he went home to every night. He thought about the silence that he usually loved so much, but which now seemed suffocating. He thought about the coldness of his world, full of deals and contracts, but completely empty of warmth. This boy, this stranger from the system, had just poured warmth into the room. He had filled the cold air with feeling. Arthur realized that he didn't want to let that feeling go. He was desperate for it, even if he was too proud to admit it. "You passed," Arthur whispered. He didn't shout it. He didn't say it with a smile. He said it like a man who has just been told he has a terminal illness and realizes that nothing matters anymore. He said it with total defeat. The room let out a collective breath that sounded like a wind rushing through a tunnel. Diane let out a small sob of relief. Arthur looked at Leo, really looked at him, for the first time. He didn't see a charity case anymore. He didn't see a pawn in a game. He saw a human being who had survived things Arthur couldn't even imagine, and who had turned that pain into something incredible. "Stand up," Arthur said. Leo slid off the bench. He stood up, straightening his oversized jacket. He looked up at the tall man. Arthur looked at the crowd. "The party is over," he announced, his voice regaining some of its strength. "Everyone, please leave. The staff will see you out." There was a murmur of surprise, but nobody argued. They could tell that the mood had shifted, that something private was happening. They began to file out of the room, quietly, casting glances back at the boy and the piano as they left. Diane tried to stay, to say something to Leo, but Arthur shook his head slightly. "Not you, Diane," he said softly. "Just the guests. Give us a moment." She nodded, understanding, and herded the children toward the exit. Soon, the large room was empty. It was just Arthur, Leo, and the piano. The silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was a peaceful silence. The city lights were twinkling outside the windows, turning the dark sky into a canvas of gold and blue. Arthur walked over to the window and looked out. He couldn't look at the boy right now. He was afraid he might start crying, and he hadn't cried since he was a child. He felt incredibly vulnerable. He felt like his skin had been peeled off. "Why did you play that song?" Arthur asked, still looking out at the city. "I've never heard it before." "It's my mom's song," Leo said from behind him. "I don't know the name. She used to hum it when I was little. Before she got sick. I remembered it." Arthur closed his eyes. The music suddenly made even more sense. It wasn't just a tune. It was a memory. It was a love letter to a ghost. Arthur thought about his own parents. He had barely spoken to them in the years before they died. He had been too busy making money. He didn't have a song like that. He didn't have a single memory that pure. Arthur turned around. He looked at the boy standing by the piano, looking small and lost in the middle of the huge floor. He realized that he couldn't just adopt this boy because of a deal. That would be a transaction. That would be buying a soul. And after hearing that music, Arthur knew that Leo's soul was not for sale. If Arthur took him in, it had to be real. It had to be because he wanted to give the boy a home, not just win a bet. "I made a promise," Arthur said, his voice rough. "I said if you played, I would adopt you." Leo nodded. "I remember." Arthur walked over to him. He stopped a few feet away. He looked down at the boy. The urge to cry was getting stronger. He felt a lump in his throat the size of a golf ball. He realized that he didn't want to be alone anymore. He realized that this boy had just broken him, completely and utterly, and maybe that was exactly what he needed. "You played," Arthur said. "So the deal is valid. I will call my lawyers in the morning." Leo looked at him, his eyes searching Arthur's face. "Is that it?" Leo asked. "I get a home now." Arthur let out a long breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He wiped his forehead, even though he wasn't sweating. He felt like he was waking up from a long dream. "Yes," Arthur said. "You get a home. But Leo, it won't just be a room. You understand, I don't want a servant. I don't want a statue. I want you to play that piano whenever you want. I want to hear that sound in this house." Leo looked at the piano, then back at Arthur. A small, tentative smile appeared on the boy's face. It was the first time he had smiled all night. "Okay," Leo said. Arthur nodded. He felt a tear finally escape his eye and roll down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it sit there, cooling his skin. He felt broken, yes. But as he looked at the boy, he also felt something else. He felt a strange, new warmth beginning to grow in the empty space where his heart used to be. "Go get your coat," Arthur whispered. "It's time to go home." Leo didn't move at first. He just looked at Arthur, his eyes wide, trying to figure out if the man was joking. He had heard adults make promises before. He had heard social workers say "forever home and I'll be back for you," only to be disappointed when those promises turned into smoke. But Arthur wasn't smiling. He looked serious, and he also looked a little bit scared, which was strange for a man who owned the whole building. "Okay," Leo whispered. He turned and walked toward the exit where the other children and Diane were waiting. Arthur watched him go. He felt a strange mix of panic and relief. The apartment was suddenly very quiet again. The guests were gone, the noise had stopped, and all that was left was the silence and the faint smell of expensive perfume lingering in the air. Arthur walked over to the bar and poured himself a glass of water. His hand was shaking so much that some of the water splashed onto the marble counter. He stared at the droplets, realizing that his life had just changed irrevocably. He wasn't just a rich man in a tower anymore. He was going to be a father. A few minutes later, the elevator doors at the far end of the room slid open with a soft whoosh. Diane stepped out. She looked tired, but her eyes were bright. She was holding Leo's small bag of belongings, a battered backpack with a broken zipper. Leo walked out behind her, wearing a thin coat that looked too light for the cold city air. Arthur walked over to them. He felt clumsy, like he didn't know how to walk in his own body anymore. "Mr. Sterling," Diane said softly. She looked at Arthur with a new kind of respect. "I have the emergency forms. I gave the staff the information for your lawyers. But I just want to say thank you. You don't know what this means for him." Arthur cleared his throat. He wasn't used to being thanked for something real. Usually, people thanked him for checks. I am keeping my end of the deal," Arthur mumbled. "That is all." Diane looked at Leo. "You be good for him, Leo." "Okay." Leo nodded. "I will." Diane hugged the boy tightly, squeezing her eyes shut for a second. Then she let go and walked toward the elevator. She pressed the button, stepped inside, and was gone. Arthur and Leo were left standing in the middle of the huge, empty living room. The silence was back, but it wasn't comfortable anymore. It felt awkward. Arthur looked at the backpack in Leo's hand. It looked so out of place in a room filled with designer furniture. "Is that all you have?" Arthur asked. Leo looked down at the bag. "Yes, sir. It's not much." Arthur felt a sharp pain in his chest. This boy owned nothing, yet he had given Arthur the most beautiful music he had ever heard. Arthur felt a wave of shame wash over him. He thought about his closets full of suits he never wore and gadgets he never used. "We will fix that tomorrow," Arthur said quickly. "But for now, let's go." He led Leo toward the private elevator. It was lined with wood and mirrors. As they rode down to the parking garage, Arthur caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He looked old. He looked tired. But next to him, Leo looked small and alive. It was a strange contrast. The garage was cold and smelled of concrete and car wax. Arthur walked toward his car. It was a sleek, black sports car that sat low to the ground. It was fast and loud and dangerous. Arthur unlocked it with a beep. He opened the passenger door and held it open. Leo hesitated. He had never been in a car like this. It looked like a spaceship. He climbed in and sank into the soft leather seat. He looked around at all the buttons and screens with wonder. Arthur got into the driver's side and started the engine. It purred to life, a low, throaty growl that echoed off the concrete walls. He eased the car out of the spot and drove up the ramp toward the street. As they merged into the traffic of the city, Arthur felt like he was seeing the world through new eyes. Usually, he saw the city as a place of business, a grid of assets and liabilities. Tonight, with Leo sitting quietly in the passenger seat, the city looked different. The street lights looked like stars. The people walking on the sidewalks looked like characters in a story. They didn't talk much on the drive. The silence in the car was easier than the silence in the apartment. It was a moving silence, filled with the rhythm of the tires on the pavement. Every now and then, Arthur would glance over at Leo. The boy had his forehead pressed against the cold glass, watching the buildings go by. Arthur realized he didn't really know Leo. He didn't know his favorite color, or what he liked to eat, or what he was afraid of. He only knew the music. But that was enough for now. It was a start. They arrived at the building a few minutes later. It was tall and imposing, with a doorman in a uniform waiting outside. Arthur pulled into the private entrance. The drive up to the penthouse was long and quiet. When the elevator doors opened, they walked back into the marble foyer. Leo stood in the hallway, clutching his backpack. He looked around at the high ceilings and the expensive art on the walls. He looked overwhelmed. "It is big," Leo said quietly. "It is too big," Arthur said, surprising himself. "It is too big for one person. It will be better with two." He led Leo down the hallway to a room at the far end of the hall. Arthur opened the door. It was a guest room, but it was nicer than most hotels. It had a large bed, a window overlooking the park, and its own bathroom. There were fresh flowers on the nightstand. "This will be your room," Arthur said. "We can buy new furniture tomorrow. You can pick whatever you want. Whatever color you like." Leo walked into the room slowly. He ran his hand along the soft comforter on the bed. He walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the city. It was a beautiful view. He turned around and looked at Arthur. "Is this real?" Leo asked. His voice was very small. "Am I really staying?" Arthur walked into the room and leaned against the door frame. He looked at the boy standing there, looking so small in the big room. Arthur felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was responsible for another human being's happiness. It was a terrifying feeling. But it was also a good feeling. It made him feel warm. "It is real, Leo," Arthur said. "I signed the papers." "Well, I will sign them in the morning. But the promise is real. You are safe here." Leo didn't say anything. He just stood there. Then, he did something Arthur didn't expect. He walked over to Arthur and wrapped his arms around the older man's waist. He buried his face in Arthur's suit jacket. Arthur stiffened. He wasn't used to being hugged. He wasn't used to being touched. He stood there with his hands hanging in the air for a second. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he lowered his arms and patted Leo on the back. It was a clumsy hug, but it was real. He could feel the boy's warmth through the expensive fabric. "Thank you," Leo whispered. Arthur closed his eyes. He felt a tear slide down his cheek, soaking into his collar. He didn't wipe it away. He just held onto the boy. "No," Arthur whispered back. "Thank you." They stood like that for a long time. The city hummed below them, but up here, everything was still. Eventually, Leo let go. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked tired. "You should sleep," Arthur said. "It has been a long night." Leo nodded. "Okay. Good night, Arthur." It was the first time he had used Arthur's first name. It sounded strange, but it sounded right. "Good night, Leo," Arthur said. He walked out of the room and closed the door gently, leaving it open just a crack so the light from the hall could shine in. Arthur walked back down the long hallway to the living room. The party was over, the guests were gone, and the staff had gone home for the night. The apartment was dark, lit only by the city lights coming through the windows. Arthur walked over to the piano. It sat there in the corner, sleek and black. He sat down on the bench. It was still warm from where Leo had been sitting. Arthur looked at the keys. He reached out and placed his hand on the smooth ivory. He tried to press a key, but he stopped. He knew he couldn't make the music that Leo made. He sat there in the silence for a long time. For years, Arthur had thought that being rich meant being powerful. He thought that having everything meant he didn't need anyone. He had built walls around himself to keep the pain out. But tonight, a 10-year-old boy with a backpack had climbed over those walls. Arthur smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached his eyes. He felt lighter than he had in years. The hollow space in his chest wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the memory of the music. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked out at the city that he owned, in a sense, but which he had never really seen until tonight. He took a deep breath. "Play this piano and I'll adopt you," he whispered to himself, shaking his head at his own arrogance. "I thought I was making a bet. But I think I just made a family." He turned off the lights and walked toward his bedroom. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't dreading the morning. He couldn't wait to wake up and hear the sound of music in his house.